A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. And so for today, I'm actually going to be steering a little bit of ways towards something different. I'm going to be looking at King Kong. No, not that one. Nah, not really. Well, maybe that one, yeah. I'll probably talk about the 76 version some other time. I consider it to be the best so far. But I'm actually going to be here to talk about the 2005 remake. Yeah, that's right. This was made by Peter Jackson and Universal Studios. And I'm talking about the studio itself, not the park. They're the same duo responsible for harboring the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And this was, at the time, the last best work that they had done. And so Peter Jackson wanted to expand a little bit more in terms of creativity, and as a longtime King Kong fan, it was quite obvious what was going to happen. In 2005, we got just that. King Kong. The latest release that had shown up since 1976's King Kong, which was done by Paramount. And so, less than 30 years later, this is pretty much what goes down. And I really ought to say, for a Universal remake of the legendary classic film known as King Kong from 1933, it goes to show that, well, if you really want to turn a kaiju into a big blockbuster in recent years, then just simply reboot a classic. A lot of people might be against remakes and reboots and all that. I myself would probably look at these things a little bit differently, because it would be wise to know the main difference between the legendary legacy of a classic and the somewhat piggybacking infamy of how a reboot would work. The big difference that comes between both the old and the new. It's very apparent in most franchises, but the thing is that in this particular instance, it is a whole different story. With a budget that has over 200... well, that's a huge, huge budget. Well over $200 million. But in the fact that they were able to be successful enough to eventually do some more to what King Kong would eventually turn out to be. In the whole franchise alone that we had had up until that point, over 70 years had passed since the first King Kong film had come out, and not to mention a sequel that they had made alongside the first one. In the same year that they had released the first one, they released this other one, which is called Son of Kong. It was the first Son of movie at the time, and so this cliche title would show up in other things. Son of Frankenstein, Son of Godzilla, Son of Blob, Son of the Mask, and other such franchises would catch on to this as well. Maybe someday I'll have one of my own like that, but back to King Kong pretty much. It's important to note that while Peter Jackson did put up some incredible attributes out there with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and eventually made it one of the greatest things ever to happen, eventually, with the fact that Return of the King was actually the first fantasy sequel to win a Best Picture Academy Award, it goes to show that Peter Jackson's unique creativity and distinct feel from how Universal creates monster movies in real life. It goes to show that with the best sort of effects that we could ever possibly get, both in visual and sound, it goes to show that King Kong 2005 would in fact become one of the best modern pieces that we would see of the time period that it was released in. Certainly not unlike what we would be able to see in the same year. Like, for example, we would see War of the Worlds, which was another pretty impressive movie at the time. One that may not have been very significant, but still. King Kong really did everything it possibly could to make itself better than the likes of most others. It has a pretty great cast, too, with the likes of Andy Serkis, whom is in fact called the Master of Motion Capture, whom actually does the various different, well, slouched poses and all that, visual effects happen on the face and whatnot, because after all, this is the same guy who has done the likes of many other characters. Serkis does an amazing job at portraying King Kong as a whole, being in the posture of a silverback gorilla walking on knuckles pretty much, and protecting Ann Darrow, whom in this film is played by Naomi Watts, from a group of V-Rexes. as they're called. A lot of people might call them T-Rexes, but in reality, they're known as Vistatorexes, or V-Rexes for short. It's just a bit of a mythical thing out there because after all, Skull Island is mythical, King Kong is mythical, and a lot of things in the film are mythical as a whole. So, not a lot will agree, but just know that those are V-Rexes that King Kong fights on screen, not T-Rexes. That's in Jurassic Park. So in any case, the thing is that King Kong is played by Andy Serkis, and Daryl in this movie is played by Naomi Watts, and we would also get to see the likes of Adrian Brody and Jack Black. Yeah, that's right. Jack Black is in fact Carl Denham, a greedy executive movie producer who wants to go and search Skull Island to film King Kong and whatnot as a way to try and get popular and earn a lot of money. But upon reaching the island, there is a lot of things that are out there. Like, for example, there's a lot of shots that take place of them actually on the sea on their way to the island itself. And it's a pretty long, drawn-out process that goes from start to finish. But the thing is that for such a big time limit that exceeds 3 hours in length, it seems a bit worthy to really build up on the world of King Kong as a whole, as opposed to what the first movie did, because they didn't necessarily have the biggest budget that money could buy. RKO Studios, who was originally the owner of the King Kong franchise as a whole back in the 30s, up until the point where they went defunct by the 1970s. It eventually got down to the point where we would be able to see King Kong done in a much bigger, supposedly better way, by bringing in things like color, CGI, lots of incredible Dolby quality sound design, and eventually so much more. It just goes to show that we would also get to know about King Kong in a much bigger and better way. There were actually a few documentaries as well as novels talking specifically about this film, in which they would describe Skull Island as a whole, about New York as a whole, and eventually about the character King Kong as a whole. Peter Jackson actually went ahead and made some pretty incredible feats with this film, including a lot of extras and bonuses. And there was even a time where on the internet, a few videos were posted about Peter Jackson teasing some potential sequels in 2006. But unfortunately, it didn't really turn up because it was in fact an April Fool's joke. One of the videos was posted on April 1st, 2006. And so, with that in mind, it was a bit of a joke, but it gives us a good insight as to how King Kong would have eventually given us some good insight on how there could have been sequels that followed this one film. But the thing is that Peter Jackson certainly knew when to stop. And more importantly, knew a lot better to just leave King Kong well enough alone. As a legendary symbol, the 8th wonder of the world, the one reason why kaiju is a huge deal for American audiences like myself. It goes to show that Jackson was willing to do anything possible to keep this thing from going underwater, drowning to death. And with that in mind, from the very start to the finish, it's just like how you might think it is. It's a lot longer in length, and there's a lot of plot details that are pretty much out there for you to see, including the famous pit scene, where King Kong throws pretty much the entire cast of human characters down into a pit where many people would assume they died. But in the original film from 1933, however, when this scene was made, it was unfortunately cut, destroyed, and to this day, as you can see right here, this is the only piece of evidence that tells us that this was once a thing that they tried to do with the original film. However, in 2005, Peter Jackson would actually try to recreate this entire thing, and after doing so, became accustomed to the many challenges that existed back in the 30s. Well over 70 years had passed, and a lot of modern technology was becoming better and much less expensive, as opposed to how things used to cost back in the 30s. But Peter Jackson did realize a lot of things as time went on, overcoming the many obstacles and challenges that the main producers and directors of RKO, including Merian Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack, were able to accomplish simply by trying their best to create all of this stuff by hand and utilize many new techniques that were not apparent at the time. And so that's one of the reasons why film school should actually start talking a little bit more about King Kong 1933 as opposed to how many times they've talked about Citizen Kane. I especially remember that I've had a couple of film classes in high school where we would talk about Citizen Kane all the time. As monumental of a film that is, though, from 1941, and as huge of a success as it was, in terms of creating new filming techniques and mastering a lot of mechanics out there that were not taught very well at the time, King Kong 1933 actually did things way bigger and better, mostly for it being almost a decade older than Citizen Kane, and also for giving us a lot of new ideas that would become more apparent to this very day. Lots of techniques were in fact done with King Kong, so you could very much expect film schools to talk a lot about Citizen Kane when they should be talking about films like this. So in any case, the 2005 remake is just incredible. It gives us the same sort of plot, the same sort of feel, and the same sort of aspect that you would pretty much get with the original. But being that it's set in the 1930s, and it also gives us the same sort of thing out there that was not apparent in the original, just expanding upon it a lot, and also having a bigger and better cast. It really goes to show that a remake can actually be even bigger and better than the original. And for the fact that it had a huge box office scoring, it just goes to show that it really went all the way, unlike anything we had ever seen. $200 million would normally be considered over budget, well over budget. Kind of like with what happened with Waterworld in 1995, where its budget also exceeded $200 million. And while it did get a pretty decent box office scoring of well over twice that amount, it just goes to show that not all films were not necessarily made to be big-time successors. But this is unlike anything we had ever seen. King Kong 2005 certainly played a big role in giving us lots of film techniques. Motion capture was unlike anything else that had ever been perfected in the world of CGI. It had been done a lot before, though, with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Polar Express, and some other stuff. But it just goes to show we would eventually be able to see a lot of new big time effects take place. And over the last 10 to 15 years, ever since this was released, we've had a lot of things to consider. And as such, King Kong 2005 certainly does deserve a big scoring. 8.5 out of 10. Certainly worthy enough to really be up at the very top in the same way that the original really does deserve to be a part of film schools of all sorts. Especially in my high school. Come on, Mr. Shannon. Talk a little bit more about King Kong 1933. Because both it and Citizen Kane are definitely monumental. So, in any case, that's just pretty much it for right now. And I feel like that there's a lot of other things I'll have to talk about soon enough, but if you want to see more, go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.